Right, I'm here for another episode of Thorinquiry, and my guest for this one is going to be Gary Lachman. He is someone who, it's possible, if you know really obscure pop trivia, that you know him when he was a member of the band Blondie as a bass guitarist in the early days, and more likely, if you're watching this interview, you know him for his work as an occult author, particularly in the field of biographies, but he's also written a number of books that kind of, I would say, try to syncretize different concepts, different religious traditions into ideas, sometimes as grand as, the Western occult tradition and topics like these. And has a new book also. What is the title of the new book? Something about Holy Russia?
It's Return of Holy Russia.
There we go. And we will talk about that a little bit later in this episode. But where I wanted to start off with is something that I noticed people don't tend to ask you, because one of the problems I've noticed with being an author from just an outside observation is a lot of the interviews that you're doing are people who maybe tangentially know you, or they're getting to know you in the interview. And so I've noticed with you, they just always go to the Blondie angle, or they go to like the big picture of the prophet, Aleister Crowley, tell me about him, something like that. They never actually ask you what I think should be a very basic first thing to kind of set the tone, bearing in mind you've written so much about the occult, which is, what are Gary Lachman's actual beliefs, or what is his model for the occult? Like, I know obviously you were a great admirer of Colin Wilson, who had his own very particular take on it. And I've heard that, I've seen you write that you at one point in time were involved with the Gurdjieff group. You were interested in that. You certainly seem to have a lot of admiration for Rudolf Steiner. How would you describe it? Because I get this sense when I read your books, which I find very interesting, and I like this perspective. You seem very much like someone who's like a secularist, but then maybe some parts of the occult vibe with you. So where do you come down? Where would you put yourself?
Well, I tell you the truth. Now, people have asked me this, and actually I got asked this rather recently because I did a online Q&A session for the Kensington Central Library here in London. And I'm always surprised, because I would think, that, I don't sort of say I believe, although I did write one book that's more sort of personal in that sense than others. It's called Caretakers of the Cosmos. We talk about grand picture. There you go. No, I would think, the tone, what I write about, obviously I'm trying to, fundamentally where I find myself is I was first introduced to all these ideas years and years and years and years ago, as you rightly say, through reading Colin Wilson's books. And, it's how he understood the occult was that it was something that was rooted in a sort of earlier form of consciousness. And he talks about sort of lunar knowledge. And it's a different kind of knowledge than what we usually associate with knowledge, which is daylit knowledge, sunlit, bright, the Enlightenment, as it were, rational, logical, episteme, as the Greeks called it, the kind of knowledge that's associated with scientific experiment, with empiricism, with observation, but also with gathering different facts and reading about them and so on and so on. And this other kind of knowledge, this lunar knowledge, which he talks about in his book Occult, is something that's not like that. But it's also, it is a way of knowing the world, and it's a more immediate, intuitive, participatory, which is a word I use in more recent writing. The central idea is that the partition which we usually experience and have been told is the case since day one of our lives, between what we call our inner world, which takes place, inside our heads, and then the outer world out there, which is real and objective, that melts away at times. It becomes permeable and porous, and you have this strange sensation of somehow having a more immediate, direct, inward kind of experience of the world. And so the occult is something along those lines. And a variety of different sorts of occult arts and sciences and so on that form the tradition are something that more or less are rooted in this kind of other kind of knowledge. So, and this is why a recent book of mine, the last few years, called Lost Knowledge of the Imagination. It's similar sorts of things. Occult just means hidden. But, I'm trying to understand and bring together in some way these two traditions, because I was first introduced sort of to this occult tradition years ago. And then through my interest in that, I got more widely interested in just the Western intellectual tradition per se. And I studied philosophy and so on and so on. And there's a lot of areas where I think they carry over. They're both talking about the same thing in a different kind of language. And it all ties in with, our two brains and yin yang and a variety of other sort of polarities. But I would say, personally, my own sort of personal project is to somehow find a way to bring these two seeming or apparent opposites together, which actually, when they work together, they do produce what we would call a kind of insight, or even, dare I say, sort of mystical experience.
Okay. In along those lines, then, listen, obviously people's personal experiences can be incredibly personal and incredibly private, understandably. But I would just ask you this: have you ever actually had something you would yourself term as a mystical experience? And I don't mean that in the very vague sense. I mean as in why people would call themselves, mystics, like this, like you're saying, almost like this, some sort of a journey into the interior world, which seem to have supernatural or, not everyday consciousness component. Have you had these experiences, would you say?
Yes. As a matter of fact, I would say I had one fairly recently. And this was, I was in California. I had been invited to participate in a symposium at the Esalen Institute, which you probably know is this very famous sort of alternative counterculture place.
Anyone who knows Terence McKenna, that's basically where.
It goes back to Aldous Huxley in the early '60s and all that. And while I was there, I had the sort of Esalen experience, and it just happened one morning when I was sipping my coffee and looking out at the Pacific, and very simply, the I and the waves were one. I mean, I couldn't, I could wax, lyrical or rhetorical about it, but, it's, we know what we're talking about. So, and again, in that sense, because I don't think mystical experience is radically different or categorically different than our own experience. I also think that the content of mystical experience is pretty much the same of everyday experience. It's just that we see it in a different way. And I'm not talking about mystical experience in the sense of a visitation or a visionary experience, Jesus or whoever it might be comes and you have an experience in that way, or you go on some strange kind of journey, that sort of thing. I'm talking more about, all of my mystical experiences, and I don't start racking them up, they're more of the Satori kind rather than the Samadhi.
Okay.
So I'm struck by the isness of things. I don't so often get the kind of blending into the great all, which, that happens at times. That's why this kind of moment when I was in California. And I after the week at Esalen, I spent a few extra days just driving up the coast. There were a few times just along the Pacific Coast Highway there. And I went through what's known as the Avenue of the Giants, which is this fantastic forest of the redwoods, the sequoias, which are they're big.
I've heard, yes.
Very big trees. I was in that, and but I tend to think this is kind of, we have many experiences like this, like throughout the day and that sort of thing, where we don't really think of them so much as mystical, but they are a kind of way in which this sort of utilitarian approach to the world, which we usually take, and we have to in order to deal with it.
Sure.
And it's getting more and more complex. When that kind of is put on hold, for a moment, and you see something and it just strikes you as odd and a little bit different. And so, this will sound strange, but I went out the other day, we're all in lockdown and all that. And I'm blessed because I have a little patch of garden here, and I went out, and I had to laugh because I was surprised by the sun. And what I mean by that, I don't mean that it was hiding behind a tree and then it said peekaboo. It's just that I looked up at it, and it was sort of like, yeah, what is that?
Sure.
What is that thing? And it's there, and it's always been there. And it just, I found myself laughing at it. So, it's more along those kinds of lines. And that's. So it is that kind of waking up. It's a kind of a Zen, I guess. That's why I said Satori, or Gurdjieff with self-remembering and things of that sort.
Since you've written so much about people who legitimately do claim to have had very strong visitation experiences, to use the words you said, extraterrestrial contact, supernatural contact, a million different variations of how you can describe it. Obviously, people like Crowley, people like Swedenborg would be obviously a very classic example if people know who that is. If you've written so much about these people and you've read so much about these people, and these people clearly there's something compelling about their characters, and they certainly seem sincere. Like Swedenborg especially doesn't seem to me like someone who, I mean, it doesn't seem like he's made it up for fame or just to seem special. Like actually, I think it's crazy to me, until I read your book, I'd almost never heard of this individual. I thought I actually knew quite a lot about this area. So essentially, I don't really buy the angle that, this is just hucksterism, which is obviously the very easy way to dismiss it. Yeah. If you've written about it so much and it clearly has some interest for you, is it something you actually would seek out? I mean, if I used the analogy of someone who wrote about other people's alien experiences, you could imagine that person might want it themselves if they could.
Not really, in one sense, because I'm more interested in our consciousness, everyday human consciousness, and all that. I mean, and I know people like Crowley. Crowley said the whole aim of he said the whole aim of his magic, the lema, or one of them, central one, was to make contact with these extra-dimensional, beings that, he did, ayahuasca and so on. But I don't know. I mean, they sometimes seem more trouble than they're worth. It all depends.
Sure.
I mean, I don't put it this way. I don't deny that these things happen. I haven't experienced anything like that myself. Although what I can say, which I would say is sort of in a gradient, is I've experienced the autonomy of what we call the unconscious.
Right.
It's intelligent, more intelligent than I am most of the time, and purposive and so on and so on. And that's not exactly, but that's sort of halfway to personalize it in that sort of intelligence. And this is what Jung, writes about when he his descent into the unconscious and things of that sort. And so, I mean, I've often thought about that because I've known, well, it's not exactly this, but there are people that I've known that I thought, I wonder if, if we pursue this, what would happen?
Right.
But then having read quite a few stories about things of that sort, they do become kind of a Shaggy Dog story, and not all of them, but I mean many of them do. And I'm half, say it. Well, the funny thing is I'm working on a book now about precognitive dreams, which this is those and synchronicities and some telepathy, but those are the sort of paranormal,
the most credible kind of psi elements.
I'm sorry.
The most kind of credible psi elements in terms of, you can at least, even scientifically, we can approach some of these things,
Oh, yeah. Well, certainly there seems to be a lot of scientific evidence for precognition. But I've been recording my dreams about it for the last 40 years off and on. So I finally got around writing about it. And so, I mean, I'm bringing that up to say like that's kind of the firsthand paranormal or whatever you want to call it, anomalous sort of experience I've had, and I've looked into it to some degree and so on. So, I mean, I didn't seek those out, but I just discovered that they happened, and I followed them up, and things of that sort. So, I mean, I guess in that sense of sort of a naturalist rather than a hunter, maybe. Like I want to sort of see how does it happen by itself, in that way.
Right.
Kind of like, okay, I'm here and I can observe this happen, but at the same time, it's me. So I can't take a completely objective and detached, position on it because I'm watching something taking place inside myself. But I've had strange dreams, or I've had sort of very. There's one I did talk about well, I don't know if I'll include it in the book, but I did mention it sort of in there. But where at one point where I had been reading quite a bit about hypnagogic states, in between sleep and waking, and lots of strange things happen in those sorts of things, and quite a few paranormal phenomena are associated with that. I remember once when I was in that state and sort of drifting in and out of a dream, I did feel like something was trying to get through that felt just very, very, more concrete than some of the other sorts of things that I had experienced in that state. And I did remember thinking, well, I can kind of decide whether I want to invite this further in or no. And I kind of said no. Actually, my life is complicated enough at the time. So, I imagine a lot of psychonauts out there that are, people interested in this sort of thing. I think, pass stuff on to chance or that kind of thing. But I don't know. I mean, I'm enough things happen already without my having to seek them out.
Yeah, sure. Well, one thing I wanted to ask tangentially along these lines then is the reason I found it interesting that you didn't seem to yourself pursue this as much is that with your background as a musician, and obviously you've literally written songs for the group band Blondie, and I presume other songs as well within your career. I think for me, one of the reasons why I find it so natural that a lot of artists from that particular field seem to have an affinity for, if not straight up occultism, at least woo-woo things, is because no one really kind of understands what that artistic process is. And you can find a billion interviews of people saying, it could be Prince, it could be something else. And they kind of, it's almost the Jesus to take the wheel angle of like, it wasn't me who wrote it. The songs just come, the words just come. I can say myself as a writer, whenever I attempt any sort of creative writing, I feel like I am actually at my best when I'm trying to get out the way. Like, I'm not claiming it's some sort of supernatural experience, but it's like the more I can sort of not think and just let the words come, they tend to be the best things I write. So I wondered, do you have a sense for this yourself? Like, have you written songs? Do you get that sense that, I mean, if we say things like channeled, it's so specific, but where would you come down on that?
Well, when I was writing songs, they did, they either came all of a piece or it didn't happen. So I wasn't a songsmith in that way, where, you can kind of hammer out a tune, and I've known people who can do that. It's a great craft, but they kind of came out. And insofar as you want to say they were inspired, it was sort of like that. And this is, again, I would say, is along the lines you're talking about. It's kind of a gradient, Nietzsche, when he's talking about how the inspiration for thus spake Zarathustra came to him, said that if you still had any shred of belief in the supernatural, you would believe that is precisely what happened. Some spirit, something else took him over.
Sure.
And that's what inspire means anyway. And so, I mean, so on a lesser level, songs used to just come out, but I had to learn how to write, which was different, because by the time, one of the things that, sort of stopped the songwriting was that I was reading too much, and what I wanted to sort of talk about was something that became more complex than what you could sort of, express in a song. And you have some anthemic kinds of tunes, which, they can express some sort of vision, but, so I just, then it took me, close to about 10 years to learn how to write something that anyone would publish, journals and magazines and that sort. And then, a few years after that to start writing books. But even there, I know what you mean. It's sort of, when, you have a flow. I know in myself, I sort of get going, you start a bit, and you read back what you wrote the day before, and you and then maybe there's an hour, 2 hours, and a 6 hour, stretch in front of the computer when you're actually writing, and it comes out in the flow, and then you sort of do the editing over that. So it's kind of a give and take situation, which is again, Laurel and Hardy, or it's the unconscious or and the conscious working together.
Sure.
It's a sort of polarity that works like that. And I think with some writing, if you kind of let it flow too much and you read it back, and it's you sort of because you have sort of it's kind of like not necessarily free association, but you sort of have certain habits and turns of phrase and things that kind of get you going. And if you sort of let those run free too much, then you read it back and it's sort of it's more, how should we say it? There's swing, but there's nothing on the swing. You know what I mean? There's something like moving the prose along, but you're actually not saying anything. And then it takes, you have to sort of go back and realize that. But there's more of a give and take, and it took me quite some time. And I'm still, with any luck, still learning.
So one thing I actually thought along these lines then that is interesting, because obviously in the modern day, people might, if they do believe in a spirit realm, contact with, let's say entities that aren't just part of you, they might try to, I mean, this has often been the case throughout history. The notion is, they've got a message for us, or this is something important to send out. That's why, half the people do seem to go crazy, because they become messianic. It's the most famous kind of reaction to that. There's not that many people come out and go, well, they were kind of boring. I think I'm over that. You tend to, if you have the experience, it tends to work. So my angle I wanted to ask was this, is the notion that they do want to send a message out and that it would go across the world. I mean, I think the analogy of writing a pop single is the best example, because I agree. The more deep you get into something like Gurdjieff or ceremonial magic, you can have a real hard time making that into a catchy pop song that people want to listen to in an elevator. So I'd actually say one of the things I found very interesting is the story of the lineage of the occult. I think most famously, when I think of it, I imagine, the alchemists having to hide all their work and, the persecution of the Inquisition. It makes it feel then like it's a totalitarian force that was suppressing this stuff. But I actually think in the modern day, when obviously the joke of the internet is every kid actually has access to the, essentially the most ancient alchemical texts if you wanted them, but nobody cares to look at them, essentially. A very rare, small, niche, weird set of people do and get very interested, and everyone else seems to generally be like, whatever. It almost feels like occult ideas, they remain occult in and of themselves, if you kind of get what I'm saying. What do you think
sure. I mean, hidden in plain sight. It's even more esoteric in that sense, because, I mean, and that in a way says what has always been said about it, where some people have said, oh, well, the occult, it's all about this elite, and there's only the enlightened or the Illuminati or the illuminated ones, and so on, or whatever, you belong to this system, whether it's Steiner or Gurdjieff or somebody else, and you think you're more awake than, but then it's like, well, no one's stopping you, it's up to you, it's in that kind of sense. There isn't any real barrier to it except the barrier of interest, whether you're interested in or you're not, and today I would say, in one sense, it's kind of a test in the sense that all of this stuff is just available now and has been available now for years. I mean, in places, just this book about Russia, I mean, it's going back some years, but in the 90s, so much of stuff that, we took for granted, just became available again to people there. And then it was really exciting. It was kind of like, wow, this is, fantastic. So it depends on the historical time and place and all that. But no, I think, because there's a glut of it, it requires the people that are really interested. And again, it's not like an elite in any kind. I try to steer away from that kind of sense, and because it's it requires the same kind of discipline and application if you're going to learn a foreign language, or if you're studying some subject. It's different in the sense that what you're studying is at the same time, yes, it's this tradition and all that and these ideas, but it's also about you in the long run. It's because you are your being should be changed through the process of understanding these kinds of things and having some of the experiences and all that. But then again, I mean, people chase after the experiences too. And you can have experiences after experience after experience. And if you don't have some kind of set of ideas or theories or insights or some kind of pattern to link them to, then they're just, they're just the same as chasing after some kind of sensuous experience. So, I mean, I think that's one of the things that, this understandable kind of rejection of the Western intellectual tradition, which is very cerebral and head-based, for something more physical or visceral or experiential, or gnosis is an experiential kind of knowledge. And that, I mean, I understand that, but then I think, okay, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's what I said earlier. We need sort of both traditions, because both traditions are born of the two sides of our brain, basically, and so we can't do without we have to have both of them. We can't do without the one or the other.
Sure. I mean, when you say that part, that you can have these experiences, but you might not take anything, like you might not codify it into any kind of philosophy. It's just an experience. It reminds me, actually, as someone who was a ceremonial magician once said that the most depressing thing about exploring the astral realm. Is that's like the internet. Like, it sounds like a brilliant idea, but there's a lot of idiots on there. That was a great way to describe it.
Yeah, I can understand that. I mean, you can, I mean, again, you can lose yourself in all of that sort of stuff too. And I mean, in a way, it's sort of like experiences with psychedelics, which can be very powerful. But I mean, it's sort of like, let me tell you about my 69th, mystical experience. It's sort of like, okay. These sorts of things kind of, they get inflated in the sense that they lose their sort of value, or they become devalued, actually. Because you should have one or two or three or four, whatever, of these kinds of experiences, and then they have some effect on you. But then again, I guess there are people who think, like, actually, no, it's about learning to be in that other realm, and you could have whole other journeys and all that kind of thing. So I mean, that's legitimate as well. But I think in terms of our existential kind of life in the world, these kind of edge experiences or frontier experiences or peak experiences or whatever, somehow they should have some kind of effect. And it's not like collect all 25, kind of thing.
Right, yes. I mean, one area I actually came to find your work and find your biographies, particularly, was through the Aleister Crowley biography. Mm. And the way I found it, I think I don't know if I'm unique in this sense, but because he's someone that so many biographies have been written about. Mm. And the main problem I had when I read a lot of the other biographies is they're all either by adepts who think he is the bee's knees, and they will just explain away everything he ever did that was mean or horrible. And, it gets sickly and sycophantical when you read too much. You're like, he has some information, but you just think, where's the critical gaze here? Mm. Or you get the people, I mean, some would say, like John Simmons obviously took this approach of like, actually, fuck this guy. A lot of it was bullshit, and you do that.
Simmons is such a funny book, though.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. No, but I know exactly. No, that's how I feel about a lot of these things. It's mostly the true believers or the skeptics and critics and all that. It's kind of like, well, let's just kind of look at it. I mean, and with Crowley, I mean, he was one of the first people I got interested in when I was doing this. First reading about all this stuff back in, it's 1975 now. It's ages ago. I mean, around the same time I got interested in Colin Wilson, I got interested in Crowley, and I read Diary of a Drug Fiend. Well, that made sense because everybody's interested in drugs.
Sure.
And that's kind of the gateway one. And then it's I told this story so many times, but where I was living on the Bowery with Chris and Debbie, and one of the guy who sort of owned the building, as it were. He was this flamboyant artist, and he was into Crowley's tarot, and he used to do these impromptu tarot readings, and so and so. And there was a kind of kitschy occult atmosphere in the place. They like voodoo dolls,
sure,
upside down pentagrams on the walls, and candles, and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I just saw, Crowley was interesting. Wow, and all that stuff kind of grabbed me. I was still in my teens, and it was very exciting and wild and adventurous and so on. And then after a while, it's kind of became rather claustrophobic because it's mostly about him, fundamentally.
Sure.
But I try to be even. I try to be balanced. I mean, I'm not just dismissing him because I think he does have I think the problem with Crowley is a lot of good ideas, but he's it just was too much about him. It was too much about he had this raging ego and this insatiable appetite, for celebrity, as it were.
Sure.
And kind of worked against him.
Do you think if he was around today, who would the closest analog be? Would he be Kanye West or something?
I have no idea. Probably, or he'd be trying to hang out with them, I guess. But
right, that would be the angle. Yeah, it's a good angle.
Some people say Trump. Some people say Trump. Okay. I mean, there's a fellow named James Wasserman who he's very much a Crowley aficionado, and he's written things about it. And I know he's written at least one article about how he sees the kind of similarities.
Oh, okay.
It's understandable too. I mean, they were both fans of Ayn Rand. I mean, Crowley was in his last days, and he was living in Hastings in this, boarding house, Netherwood. He read the Fountainhead, and he spoke very highly on the other hand, and I mean, not that that's necessarily damning, but it sort of gives you, gives you kind of context. It's this sort of libertarian, this libertarian sort of, context.
No, I think it makes a lot of sense. I can see the Venn diagram overlap on that one if you think of some of his philosophy and some of the things espoused in that book. And the thing I want to ask was this, is like, as I'm setting up here, you obviously did take a very critical eye to what he did. In fact, one of the things I found very interesting about your biography was that you didn't end by saying, he was a sham, he was bullshit, or that he was wonderful. Your kind of takeaway from my memory was that the ultimate indictment was, if he did all this magic and all these amazing things happen, how come he sort of fucked his own life up? That's kind of the gist.
But sadly, that's true of many of the great magicians.
Sure.
I mean, not many of them are very successful. If you look at their lives, I mean, they kind of they have some celebrity and some success, and then it's kind of downhill. And sort of melodramatically, you want to say, if only he had used his powers for good.
Sure.
But he wasn't really evil. I mean, I think Crowley wasn't evil. He just was completely self-obsessed. In fact, I said I would put him on this kind of Asperger's or autism kind of gradient, because he seemed constitutionally incapable of, except for rare times, being interested in another human being. For either they impressed him, and so like Eckenstein or Ellen Bennett, or he sort of dominated them, kind of thing. And I know he loved baby daughter and things, that kind of thing. But there isn't any kind of sense where he ever came out of his own kind of life world and grasped the objectivity of other people and that kind of thing. And not to say he was uniquely impaired with this. I mean, we all suffer from that. As William James pointed out in his wonderful essay on a certain blindness in human beings. But it seemed to be, central to Crowley's kind of character and to the problems in his life and all that.
Sure. Because I know another very common indictment, and it's an easy one to make, bearing in mind. I think the key detail people often don't know about Crowley's life is they hear the sum of money he inherited and they don't convert it. They don't know that he's basically a millionaire.
Oh,
so
yeah,
you can imagine
the
crazy. Yeah. So the thing is, one of the obvious indictments you can make is, if you have these magical powers, and certainly he was someone who said that some of these things could externally manifest. It wasn't just ideas in his mind. The easy indictment is, we'll just get some money doing that then, mate. But I would ask basically, here's my attempt at a nuanced question along those lines is, am I being too romantic in suggesting that it's not that his magic didn't work, but I would say if I look at the things that were magical about his life and the effect he had on the world, it would be through influence, actually. Like the idea that he was this guy who in his own time, as you're alluding to, desperately wanted to be famous for these things. I mean, he was basically one of the first people I've seen who almost had that mentality of there's no such thing as bad publicity. Like, if I can't be known as a cool guy, let them know me as the wickedest man in the world. He almost was into that. So the thing is, in his era, he didn't succeed very much in that. He was just kind of like, it felt like, a page 3 story, a little box, Crowley's up to it again. But then you look at this dormant period, and then now, I mean, he is ubiquitous, and even in the field of the occult, he towers over everything.
You have to thank the 1960s.
There's something magical in that, right?
Well, I mean, you said John Simmons, so you have to thank him. I mean, he's the one who made that happen with that book. But I mean, in that sense, well, I mean, again, it all depends how thinly you want to slice, what's magic and what's not. I think Crowley, put bluntly, was able to throw himself into some unconscious state in which he occasionally was able to induce a synchronicity, make something happen, and that crude, basic kind of magic, sort of make stuff happen, as opposed to the more mystical, meditative, esoteric side of magic, where you contact your holy guardian angel and rise on the plains and you practice the Golden Dawn kind of tradition, but just basically make stuff happen. And there's a couple of, but it's not particularly interesting stuff. You know what I mean? Sure. I mean, he didn't really work very well getting the money that he tried to make through the sex magic, things of that sort. And he's always, once he blew all that money, and there was a huge amount of money. And the other thing with that is people always they blame his Plymouth Brethren upbringing. Understandably, he was this insufferable fundamentalist. But the other side of that was that he was a spoiled brat. He got anything he wanted. Anything he wanted. He grew up with talking about the silver spoon, he had a whole dining set, and then he inherited it, and then he went bad, and then he went bad, and he said, oh God, he got that money, and then he really went for it, and that was one of the problems too. He never really came up against resistance, that's why he was a bad editor, and I would say he was a bad poet. He's an interesting poet, some of the stuff, but he's not like a poet. The story about him and Yeats and all that, and that kind of thing. He just doesn't have it because he had no sense of editing himself, and everything he did was absolutely fantastic and great. And
that's kind of my line in the sand with Crowley. Like, I actually am very interested in some of these things. I even think at certain topics, Book 4 is an obvious example. He sometimes does a very lucid job explaining things. But I would agree.
Absolutely.
I always say my line in the sand is the people who are like, yes, and he was also a fabulous poet, and his paintings are incredible. It's like, whoa, I feel like you've just bought into the whole package here, mate. Like, I don't know about that, the poetry and the paintings, guys.
Yeah. No, I mean, I personally, I think the paintings are puerile and all of that, and because he liked scat, and he liked all this weird obscene stuff, and it wasn't only. I mean, okay. Oh, yes, he was striking a blow for freedom against, the repressive Victorian Edwardian and so on.
Sounds like a good excuse.
And he also had a personal interest in this kind of stuff.
Yes.
Maybe it was an acquired taste at a certain point. I mean, that's what I mean. I think, and that's not, he's not unique in that. You could argue that Michel Foucault, a lot of his argument is about saying it's okay for him to, go indulge in. Sort of, dark sex and
it is interesting how his philosophy did line up with his real life. Yeah,
it's like, but I think that's the thing. I think Crowley just never came up against much resistance until then. The money ran out, and and his luck ran out. And but I think there was a side to him that was big. He had a larger than life side. He attracted a lot of weaklings, but not only weaklings. As you say, I think many times he's very lucid. I mean, the 8 lectures on yoga, Book 4, which is the first book he wrote about magic, with Preston Sturges's mother, the filmmaker Preston Sturges, married Yeste Sturges. I mean, that's one of the strange, stories there. And he had all these strange encounters with people. Fernando Pessoa, the Portuguese poet. But Book 4 is this wonderful, lucid, exposition of his ideas about magic and also about sort of genius on demand. This, which I think is the most interesting, scientific.
I mean, that's right in the Colin Wilson kind of
part of
wheelhouse, right?
It's like, this is William James and all those kinds of experiments, and he's very brilliant in many ways when he's writing about drugs. I mean, I gave a talk here last year or so about Aleister Crowley on drugs. And when wasn't he? But it was about all the different, he wrote very insightfully about, hashish and, peyote and absinthe and so on and so on. And he had firsthand experience and that kind of thing. And I would say, in one sense, probably the most important contribution he made was his own, record of his attempt to kick heroin. Because he was rigorously truthful and painfully truthful, with himself and honest in it and all that. And so he failed, but at least it's this, it should be up there, along with Burroughs' writings and all that kind of thing as well. And to some aficionados, it is. So it's too easy to dismiss him as a mountebank and a charlatan and all that. Although he had both of those in him, and it's too easy to embrace him as, the prophet of a new age, and so on. And it's like, but I think we owe him a debt of thanks. That's what I say in the book, because he showed us that this one particular route doesn't work. We don't have to follow him. He went ahead and he chopped through the jungle, and that way doesn't take us where we want to go. But let us thank him for showing us that.
Sure. Now, one of the reasons I also, in terms of the personal aspect, always kind of didn't really vibe with Crowley is actually quite similar to, if we bridge now to talking a little bit about Gurdjieff, is as much as I can totally understand that some of what they're doing is actually the guru technique. Like, you think of the Zen masters, like bonking someone on the head with a cane instead of, explaining, because, they essentially it's about having the experience, and, you can't just tell someone the answer and then know the answer. It's not the answer without the experience. So I get that there is sort of like I mean, it's like that thing from the Hindu tradition. Like if you want to learn, you have to be willing to be hurt. Essentially, like it's somehow is tied in. I understand this could be explained away as it's a technique and stuff, but particularly, I mean, Crowley with some of his disciples, and especially Gurdjieff, the way he treated a lot of people, it just seems too harsh to me. Like, as much as I like the profound elements, and I love the idea of an intense person who's so much of something that they're so vital, but I have a real hard time with just essentially how horrible they can be to people. I can't kind of do that myself. So how do you vibe with Gurdjieff then? How does that not bother you?
Well, I mean, well, what can I say? I think, and Colin Wilson said that Gurdjieff was one of the most, remarkable men of the 20th century. I think that was right. I think that's true. I can understand what you're saying. In fact, my book about Ouspensky, who's best known as Gurdjieff's leading disciple, was about how I felt that Gurdjieff didn't understand him in many ways, and Ouspensky himself sort of. The horrible. I mean, the thing about Ouspensky is that he starts out, he's this kind of romantic, poetic, philosopher, scientist, but he writes sort of fiction. He wrote a novel and short stories, writes a lot about beauty and art and that kind of thing. And then he goes through the school of Gurdjieff, and he comes out on the other side of it, and he's jettisoned this earlier kind of self, and he's a stern, rigorous, scientific kind of exponent of the system, and he rejects this early self entirely, and I think that was a big mistake. And unfortunately, Ouspensky found that to be the case himself in his later life, because he basically wound up drinking himself to death, sadly.
Yeah, I got there again. The conclusion I kind of took from that book, the Ouspensky one, another very good one, I think, was almost like, you almost had a sense of, what if he could have just not met Gurdjieff? What if he'd gone down that path? Because he clearly had his own kind of vigor, right?
Oh, this is what some people suspect Ouspensky, because he believed in this notion of eternal recurrence. Rather than reincarnation, we're born again, but into exactly the same life. So you and I have had this conversation before,
right?
That's why we're sailing right through it. And so but if you're aware and you can wake up and you become aware of different crossroads and moments in your life, you can make a decision that can alter things. So it's kind of like Groundhog Day. That film is based on.
There you go.
Bill Murray was involved in the work. It's a sort of secret to some degree, I think. But and what some people suspected that the next time around, Ouspensky may not have gone to meet Gurdjieff or something like that. But I mean, that's a bit harsh. Thing is, because I think Gurdjieff's immensely important. I don't, but I did think that the kind of questions I raised in my book needed to be asked. And I also think that Ouspensky's got a lot of bad press in one kind of line of dissent, one sort of tradition in the Gurdjieff work and all that. But I know exactly what you mean. I mean, Gurdjieff, he was an exponent of what William James called the bully treatment. And this was, James has this wonderful essay called The Energies of Men, where he's talking about the phenomenon of second wind. Where you're running a marathon and I can't go anymore, and then you just push yourself a little bit more, and suddenly an extra, petrol tank kicks in, and you're going. And there's all different examples of that, and we've experienced it different times. And James says this is the bully treatment was when you have these neurasthenic patients who just refuse to make any kind of effort, and you force them to make some sort of effort. And he said at first there's intense resistance, and then there's immense relief. Because what happens is they push themselves beyond these limits that are false. They're neurotic limits to themselves that they've come to accept, but they're not. They're true limits, and not the true limits of their vitality in life, and so on and so on. And Gurdjieff developed a whole system of methods to do that, to push people beyond, their sort of limits. And many people blessed. I mean, there were casualties along the way, but he was a harsh man. He said, better to die trying to wake up than live sleeping. So he never promised anybody a rose garden, but I do think, yes, there are times, and he also was learning along the way. This is one of the questions too. He said that he had brought this tradition back from the Saruman Brotherhood and book meetings with remarkable men and so on. But at the same time, you do get the idea that he was learning as he went, and he was experimenting, and he called his students his guinea pigs. So it's one of the things too, if you look at, a lot of spiritual things today, whatever you want to call it, it's a lot of health and well-being, mind, body, spirit. And you go back to these early people, Gurdjieff, Blavatsky, a little bit earlier, Ouspensky, Crowley, they didn't care about that. They were pushing themselves out to the extremities to force, human experience out into the unknown and all that. And we've withdrawn, and it's a strange kind of thing, there's the story, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, that when, Gurdjieff died and they performed an autopsy, the doctor said, "My God, this man should have been dead years ago. His intestines are completely, corrupted," or whatever. So this whole idea that, the body is a kind of, temporary lodging for the spirit, and our job is to, not necessarily, not masochistically, because we know the monks and all that do that kind of thing, the flagellation, not necessarily doing that, but not giving in to artificial limits that we've set for ourselves. And when you're writing, I know myself, there's times I'm writing, just, okay, I got to push, let's get those words out there. And then suddenly something happens, something clicks, and you've written 2,000 words. So, we do, we live subject to fatigue. I'm trying to remember the line from James, but I can't remember it exactly. But something about, we live subject to, degrees of fatigue, which would come only from habit to obey. And
yes, that's the angle I would say as well, is that because as you describe, when you say that, when you're making yourself write something, every fibre of your being doesn't want to. It goes, "No, there's nothing there. Look, this is a waste of time." But as soon as you make the breakthrough and you write it all, you think, "Why don't I do this all the time? This is brilliant. I could access it all the time." But then you very quickly lose that,
Yeah, it's like what I said. It's a tennis match, and it's not, it's something that you learn over time. That I know invariably I go through. Just before I start a book, after I've read everything, I've read, I can't read anymore. I can't absorb anymore. And it has to kind of settle, it goes through the gestation sort of period, and I can't write yet, but for the 2-3 weeks, whatever, before I start writing, it's horrible, but I can't, I can't avoid it. I know it's going to happen every time. It's not as if, I know what that's about now, and I'm not going through that. No, it's part of the process. The more you're able to sort of understand that, you don't control it, but at least you recognize that it's, you don't really want to blow your brains out because you feel okay, next week, I'll start typing next week.
Because, I think actually people will find it very revealing you'd even say as much as that, because one area that, even before I'd read Beyond the Robot, I could easily see the influence of Colin Wilson on you, is you are similarly prolific. The sheer amount of books you've written. Now, what's funny is people might imagine naively, well, that's the person who they love to just write all the time. That's the thing they do. As far as I can tell, as a layman, and having read a number of his books, I almost got the sense that he just loved to read, and then he was like, I better get on and write a book about that topic, actually, I better do something with it.
He said he was he became a writing machine. It depends, what you count as a book, but he's certainly, it's like 150 or something.
Oh, it's amazing.
He just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. I remember he told me, he wrote The Occult, which was a huge book, in a few months. And I thought, my God, it's like 600 pages. That's enormous. This book, Return of Holy Russia, it's a big book. It's about, I don't know, what is it, 450 pages, something like that. But it took me a year and a half. I don't know how we got through something as a doorstopper like The Occult in just a few months. But, there are all these stories. I've been reading and rereading a lot of J.B. Priestley, who I think is a very good writer who's not, read that much these days. But he talks about, because he's very interested in time. He called himself a time-haunted man. Okay. And he talks about how there's a kind of, when he was writing some of his plays, that they just wrote themselves. And he wrote at this incredible speed, for 2 weeks. And then you have Time in the Conways or something like that, or, one of the other, Dangerous Corner or something. Well, I don't know if it's those plays, but, something along those lines. And so, that happens. Again, I'm pretty steady. I have sort of banker's hours. I plod every day. I have a quota of words I have to get through every day. There's a bottom line, And then, anything above, I try to get above it, but, there's the bottom line. I have whatever.
Do you use most of it? Does any of it does it hit the cutting room floor, as it were?
Some of it I have to use later in the book. It's not, this won't work here, but yeah.
Right.
I'll have to take this out now. So sometimes there's things that you just let them come out. I mean, that was something else. And then, it's horrible. I mean, you want to do this. I can't think of anything else. I can't think of any other way to make a living. But I mean, I want to do it at the same time. It's painful. And when I write, and I know, like that. I mean, I did write when I start. It's usually when you start the book, at least with me. You're into it, and then one day you write 1,500, 2,000 words, and you realize, no, I can't put that. It's not going to work there. And then you got to take it out, and then I just have a horrible night because I can't wait to go fix it. So I have a lot invested, in that kind of thing. That tells you something about the psychology of creativity.
In as much as I contrasted the two of you with being very prolific there. Another sense, I mean, obviously there's all these anecdotes that he had these sheds that was full of crime books and all sorts.
Absolutely,
Are you someone also? Do you have a similar approach? Like, do you read a lot of books before you write your book?
I got a lot of books, but nothing like he had like 40,000 books. There's a whole story about the IRS going to him because he was buying all these books and they thought he was reselling them.
No, I see.
And he had to convince them that there just aren't any libraries around here and that kind of thing. And I visited him quite a few times, and then I've been down there after, since he died, 2013. And talk about the sheds and all that. A lot of those books, they were in danger of being damaged because of the humidity and that kind of thing. And I was actually helping his widow, Joy Wilson, with Colin Stanley, who's his bibliographer, who was down there. And one of the things that Colin Stanley's done is he's created this Colin Wilson archive up in Nottingham University. So a lot of his papers and things like that are all up there, and with the idea that eventually he'll become an academic. I mean, he's worthy of it. Although I think Colin, actually, obviously would feel, yes, of course they should study me. At the same time, academia was rather dull. But I mean, one of the things is eventually it'll come around to that because there's always a need for new stuff.
Sure.
Like the occult and the esotericism. That's one of the hottest things in the academic world. They wouldn't touch it for ages. Now it's like, they kind of run out of things to do. And so I know at some point Colin will become, somebody's thesis paper. There probably are quite a few already. But yeah, he had the Crime Shed, which sounds wonderful. Sounds like that should be.
It sounds sick. Yeah.
It should be the title of a book itself, The Crime Shed. But it was all these, true crime books. Wall to wall. And then you had another shed that had all these other books wall to wall. And then the house itself, I mean, any flat surface had books on it, or DVDs, or, VHS tapes, or, whatever. Everything, And I remember different times going there and seeing the same book on the bottom of a stack, like increasing, like over 20 years or something. It's like, that book's been there. That's like, no, it was remarkable. And he read everything. I'm in my little way. That's what I do. I mean, I say, when I educated myself following up with the leads that he would lay out in his books. So if you read his books and you follow up all the people he writes about, that radiates out. And then, after a while, you've read quite a few books, and then you start to put them together. And that's what, I did at some point. I mean, because I was playing in Blondie and in my own band. I was reading all this kind of stuff. And, I dropped, when did I stop? I guess 81 was the last year I was playing music.
When you say the part about, obviously he was someone who was not shy about suggesting, like, he did think of himself as brilliant and that people should read his books, and that he was ignored, and, he obviously felt somewhat victimized, at least early in his career, because he didn't get the attention his work he presumably thought merited. Is he someone where, like, the problem with that is, calling someone arrogant, I mean, it's just not bottom in him. Like, there's a lot of people who are brilliant who are incredibly arrogant, and I sometimes wonder how much of that goes hand in hand. I think you need a little bit of that, otherwise you don't put a book out in the world. So what do you actually think? Was he a great man? Was he someone who you'd put in that class of genius with some of these other people?
I don't know about great man. I think he was brilliant. I mean, you have to remember, he was this young guy out of Leicester back in 1956. When The Outsider he was 24, The Outsider was published. He had spent the last 10 years convincing himself, if not anybody else, that he was a genius. So, developing the kind of self-belief that you need really to launch yourself. I mean, today, in many ways, yes, in many ways it's easier. You got the internet, the YouTube and all that. People can launch themselves out there in different ways. There's other problems because of that. There's so much of it, so it's easy to get lost. But and then the first book is published, and then he wakes up and he's famous. He's overnight, and so everyone's yes, you are. You're right. And, sadly, he got caught up in the whole angry young man thing, where there was lots of other young geniuses, too. And it became like you say, the Daily Mail or News of the World kind of thing. And he realized that he was getting famous, not for the actual book, any of the ideas in the book, but just because he was 24 and he was working class and, he didn't go to university and he's this egghead from Leicester and all that kind of thing. And, but yeah, I think, he was perhaps injudicious, but then you have to, he was going against the stream, he was swimming upstream on his own. I mean, none of the books had any kind of the impact that The Outsider did until he did The Occult, which is like 15 years later. So, he continued to write. But people, it's a kind of handy tag. I mean, even after his death, I mean, I got into this thing where I challenged this journalist named Terrence Black, and Colin died in 2013. He wrote this, I guess it was supposed to be funny, kind of satirical piece about him, precisely about all this sort of stuff, genius. Or something about I think it was something along the lines of how not to succeed as a writer. Like, number one is, declare genius or something like that. And I just was I challenged him to a duel publicly. And he retracted the piece and he published an apology. I mean, this was just a handy thing to pull out, when you don't, how it is,
Sure.
All these people, they don't read the books. They read what somebody else wrote about him. And they juggle it around a little bit and they produce their 700 words about it and they shoot it out there. And this is like, hardly anyone really read the books. People who did read the books realized that actually, maybe a long time ago he was going on about what a genius he was, but actually this is, like Wells and Shaw and his heroes, he wrote too much. But I'd rather a Wells and Shaw who wrote too much than, Samuel Beckett wrote too much, according to Wilson.
Sure. Yes, exactly.
But you know what I mean? There's something, and they're not just, they're a personality as well. It's a worldview, and it's this kind of very vital. He had a very, he didn't address political and social questions in the way that Shaw and Wells did, but he had this vital sense of, his writing was an attack on the world in the sense of not attack on the world, damning it, but trying to understand the world. Trying to gain a bit of traction on the enigma of our existence.
Since, as you mentioned, despite the fact that even in his kind of fringe pop culture, I would say, association, like people will know of him, or they might have heard the name, or maybe they know the big two books, they know The Outsider, they know The Occult. Even so, they might pass judgment, but you can tell most people have not read beyond that. And actually that's one area where he's one of those people who really disabused me of the notion that to become a published writer is like being a rock star making millions of dollars, because what you quickly learn is, there's certain writers in history where if you calculate how many hours it took, they were working for below minimum wage, despite the fact, the works are brilliant. So the question I had to you was, since you also have chosen some very obscure characters to write about, like Swedenborg's a great example, like it's unlikely that's ever going to be, like GQ magazine's, this is the book you got to read this month. It's never going to blow up and make you millions and millions of dollars. So actually I want to ask, since you referenced The Fountainhead earlier, there's a great scene in The Fountainhead where the older architect tells the Howard Rourke character essentially, like, don't be like me, don't make the mistake, like if you go against the grain, they destroy you, they won't let you succeed. Was there ever a sense of that when you made these pilgrimages, you got to know Colin Wilson? Because you, in some sense, you've trodden some of that path as well, you've done some very good books that sometimes people might never have heard of.
What can I say, I wish, for the kind of books I'm writing, they're not doing too bad, but it'd be great to, have a book that sold a lot like that. I did this book on Trump. Did
that do well?
I'm sorry?
Was that one that did well?
Well, it did well in the sense that it paid for itself very quickly.
Okay.
And I was, receiving royalties from it very quickly, which, sort of the first kind of royalty period around, which is pretty good for a book of mine. And it's had different patches where it's sold, in recent weeks, it's been selling a lot more than weeks before, and so on and so on. But it's kind of, I think it's different too, because like when Colin was writing, there was still the kind of, it wasn't the age of the expert, so he was, a well-read, educated, individual who knew about, lots of things, could write a history of these things, and also tie it together with kind of ideas of his own, so on and so on. And that kind of approach started to go out, I would say, sometime in the 80s into the 90s, and then especially, and then it really, the whole New Age thing kind of took over. So, yes, there was the occult boom. I did my first book, Turn Off Your Mind, was about the occult revival in the 1960s, but they really had a kind of occult publishing boom in the 70s. Colin, the occult was one of those, and then there's follow-up mysteries in the later 70s, and lots of other people, Stan Gooch, Lyle Watson, Jeffrey Ash, Francis King, lots and lots of other stuff coming out at that time. But it was it wasn't like by PhDs or Dr. So-and-so or something, or Professor so-and-so. And then that shift kind of happened sometime in the 80s going into the New Age. And then this is when the kind of health and well-being kind of thing kind of moved in. And it was just, I don't know how to say it. It just changed. And it didn't have, everything became sort of academic in one sense. It was either academic or popular, And I guess I'm in between. People say, oh, your books are kind of academic. Well, they're not really academic, my books. I do my homework, but I try to have them be, readable. That's the one thing Colin said to me. He says, make sure it's readable.
He certainly lived up to that. That's one thing. That's one of the reasons I know people don't read the books. They're so easy to read. Like even the terminology he'll make up is so matter of fact. That's one thing I enjoy about it.
No, he just slides, and that was the thing. So one of my secrets when I write a book is I go back and I reread a couple of his books just to get that kind of flow. But where I find myself, I have to say, is like somewhere in between. My books are the kind of too intellectual to be really popular, but they're kind of too accessible for the academics to kind of. So I've even had this. People, I've been asked to contribute to academic publications, and I have contributed to some. But I remember sending something to one person, and the editor said, I almost asked you to rewrite it because it's too readable. And I said, well, I have to keep that. I have to keep that email because the problem with this piece is it's too readable. I love this. Okay. It's too good.
It says something about academia, certainly.
This is one of the ones I have to remember. So it's like, I try to write the kind of books that I like reading, which are about ideas, about interesting people, about their lives and their context, and we are part of that. We find ourselves here at the cutting edge, of history, and there's a lot of stuff that happened behind us, and I'm trying to grab some of it and understand some of it, and and to get some sense of where we are now.
The book you referenced there, and just another one I've read, Turn Off Your Mind, is I actually really like that. I would actually draw the parallel to the Crowley book, that you are at times in a way that others who write about that period are absolutely going to, again, they're either going to go incredibly conservative, and that's why the 60s were bad, or they're going to be so far out there and they're just remembering the rose-tinted haze of their LSD heyday, and it was all fabulous and brilliant and everything's been rubbish since then. You kind of at times almost cast a withering gaze at that. You kind of popped the bubble that it was. The darkness that's lurking underneath that, I was staggered. Do you think that, is this the case for all great periods in history? If we really could sort of pull back the curtain, would they all have this mire to them?
Well, I think in my case, in a way, I didn't consciously do this, but there's, I don't know if you know the literary critic Harold Bloom. And he had this idea about the agon, the anxiety of influence. And so you grow up reading writers and they influence you, but then at some point to break away, you have to kind of fight with them,
Sure.
And in a way, that's kind of what happened in that book, because I loved all that stuff. I mean, I was a kid of the 60s. I loved the 60s. I grew up at that time. I mean, the British invasion, the Beatles, that turned me into an Anglophile. That's many reasons why because I saw the Beatles and Ed Sullivan in 1964 or 63. That's why I live in London now. So, well, that's not the sole reason, but it informed
sure.
That kind of thing. So I love all that stuff. But then when I went back, I didn't set out to kind of show the feet of clay, as it were. Originally, the idea was, oh yes, the occult revival of the 1960s. Well, that's But when I started to actually look into it and that kind of thing, well, actually, there's all this strange parallels between stuff happening in Germany in the 20s leading up to Hitler and all this weird. Oh God, this stuff isn't really new. There was all these other the original counterculture starts in the late 19th, early 20th century in Switzerland in a place called Ascona, and it's all this strange stuff. And so and then actually when you start looking, at some of these people, some of the sacred cows, as it were, like Timothy Leary or Alan Watts and all that. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's dubious about them, and I got into trouble with lots of people because of it.
I can imagine, yeah.
At the same time, I just thought like, well, it's there. It's a good. A lot of people. I mean, what I like about the book, it was because it was in an edition. That's the U.S. edition, and there was a UK one here by Daedalus. And on the back, I said, it's been acclaimed by Satanists and fundamentalist Christians alike.
It's a good line.
So, come on, I must be doing something right. I'm pleasing both sides of the fence here. So, and it's it's fun. I think I give a lot of talks and things like that, and I think people appreciate. I have a kind of offhand, devoutly irreverent, I would say. I don't go out of my way, but it's also. I mean, I think the sanctimonious kind of approach is really boring to tears. And just the dismissive is just like, yeah, let's check these people out. And there's some obvious things that are going to strike us as weird. And there's some other stuff that, I will try to show you like, yeah, this is strange. But actually, once we start to look at it, we can understand it and see how it's a very important contribution to our understanding of consciousness or whatever, that kind of stuff. I mean, that was one of the things about how I did the book on Steiner. I remember, yes, when I was, my interest in Steiner started when I was still living in Los Angeles, and I was working at a New Age bookshop. It was the sort of the preeminent metaphysical bookshop west of the Rockies, a place called the Bodhi Tree. And they had a whole wall of books that were either, by Steiner or his lectures or books about him. And I was doing a degree in philosophy at the time. And Steiner, he wrote about Hegel, he wrote about Nietzsche and Kant and all this kind of thing. And then what really got me interested in him is this fantastic building that he designed and built.
Sure.
It's called the Goethe Anum. It was burnt down. It was made of the same wood that violins are made of. And it's this fantastic Art Nouveau expressionist, wonderful temple, these wonderful flowing organic lines and all that kind of thing. And I saw that, and I was very interested in expressionist architecture, the art movement, expressionism. One too many buildings made. There's the Einstein Tower in Potsdam outside of Berlin, and a few others. But this is one of the ones that they showed, and like, this is incredible stuff. And like, who, what's this guy about? And then I found myself reading him, and then on one page he would have this really interesting kind of, critical inquiry into some of Kant's ideas. And the next page he's talking about the Buddha on Mars. And I think, well, yeah, he's brilliant over on this page. I have no idea what he's talking about here. But how do I equate the two? And so that was, and then years later, when I actually got around to writing the book about Steiner, my sons, when they were young, they went to a Steiner school here in London. And I just found that a lot of the parents didn't have any idea about him. And they were...
Yeah, that is the most shocking part, isn't it? Is that this is someone where he doesn't have the name of even the people we've discussed in this conversation, but in some sense, on a very real everyday level with those Waldorf schools, he has immense impact.
Waldorf schools.
I'm guessing most people who send their kids there have no idea really what he was talking about. I don't think they even know who Rudolf Steiner is.
Yeah, exactly. You have the schools, you have the biodynamic farming. you've got the anthroposophical medicine, you've got eurythmy, and art, and all those. I mean, he's one of these guys too. I mean, I think in the sense that, how should I say it? Steiner was brilliant, but in a way, it obviously very different than Crowley. But also, they kind of had their fingers in lots of pies. They did lots of different things. So it's kind of like they're not absolutely brilliant in one thing, but they do lots of other kinds of things that are, they're very good and interesting and fascinating in each of these different kinds of things. And Steiner did so much. But and they were put off, I found, by this kind of sanctimonious sort of hagiographies that are written about Steiner and all that kind of thing. And I just thought, okay, well, here, I'm interested in him. Let's go for it. And then, he had an interesting life. He was, strange individual, but all of these people are.
Sure.
I mean, there's a very interesting book by the psychologist Anthony Storr called Feet of Clay, which is a study of gurus. And one of the things that comes out about people like Gurdjieff, people like Steiner, and Rajneesh, and some others, is that they're just, there's something different about them. They don't really have the kinds of relationships that you have. Ouspensky isn't like that. Ouspensky, he wasn't a guru. I mean, he set himself up as one. That was something else he shouldn't have done, I think. The reason I say this about him, because I love Ouspensky. I have a great deal of admiration. He was one of the people who really got me interested in this stuff ages ago.
Why do you specifically empathize with him so much? Because a lot of these people I've heard you write about, some of them you have admiration for, etc. But it feels like there's some connection between you and him.
I think, when I was first reading this stuff, when I read his books early on, so Tertium Organum and New Model of the Universe, before I read Gurdjieff and Search for Miraculous. And, just because I feel like, he as I said, he started out as this more romantic, poetic, open kind of character, but then he went through this transformation and he sort of, cut off a part of himself, and I just somehow just empathized, and there was a certain kind of sadness in it that I just felt, and again, he's also he's not aloof in this kind of way where you can't really have the same. I don't want to say they're saints, but they sort of like saints, Gurdjieff and Steiner, all that, in the sense that you can't really approach them in the same way that you can just writing about. Ouspensky was a philosopher, a thinker, a writer. He knew things, he had experiences, but I don't think he was a teacher in that kind of way. And I don't mean that to be any kind of, criticism of him either. I just think, just like, Colin Wilson wasn't a teacher in that way. He was a writer. Brilliant. Many brilliant ideas, he had experiences, he communicated them, but he wasn't a guru in that kind of way. So, I'm personally more interested in those kind of characters than the gurus themselves, because I don't know how to say it. Although, someone asked me recently in an interview if I had, 3 people I could put together in a room and sort of, be there and watch them interact and hear their conversation, who would it be? And I said Gurdjieff, Jung, and Colin Wilson. So I think, interaction between Gurdjieff and Jung, I think, would be interesting.
Sure. If we talk a bit about your new book, the Russia book, one thing I found, even just as a concept, almost I just never thought of it this way, is when I, in my own mind, model Europe, whatever that means nowadays, and I think of Russia and I think of, the world wars, to me, I always thought of Russia as like, this is like, it's like this is the furthest Europe goes, and it's starting to extend into the Asian landmass. But a sense I actually got when I started looking into some of this stuff was it's almost the other way around. It's the alien. It's Asia bleeding into Europe, and we get this very. That's why there's such an unusual people. There's really no one like them. What would you say on this topic?
Oh, I think that's one of the themes in the book, or one of the conundrums in Russian history. Certainly. Well, I was going to say certainly since Peter the Great, but it went back earlier than that. But yeah, were they Western? Were they Asian? One of the ideas I talk about in the book, and I talk about it also in previous book, Dark Star Rising, which is about Trump, but also has a long chapter about Putin and stuff going on in Russia, is this Eurasian idea, in the sense that Eurasia is this concept of this vast landmass, stretching from Vladivostok, into Europe, and this was like the mother of all continents, and this is being sort of promoted in Russia as the idea of a new civilization, rising up in the 21st century. I mean, the West is going down. It's losing power. I mean, the 20th century was the American century. I mean, the 21st century isn't the American century. Even Trump, the whole idea of America first and this kind of battening down the hatches suggests that, America is in kind of a retreat mode, a defense mode, that kind of thing. And so this whole idea that this new, not a new nation, not even just a new empire, which, funnily enough, this is the only time in Russian history, if I understand it correctly, where it's not an empire. Throughout the last 1,000 years, as it were, a millennium of its history, it was an empire in one form or the other. And this was like an absolutely new civilization. This is, I don't know if you know the book Decline of the West by Oswald Spengler.
Sure.
100 years ago, it was like a popular bestseller after World War I. And the whole notion that, he had this biological notion of civilizations where, they're born, they grow, they reach maturity, then they start to fade and die. And from Spengler's point of view, the West was on its way out. And he too saw, good, interesting things happening in Russia. And Rudolf Steiner did in the early part of the 20th century. Hermann Hesse and many, many different people, had this vision or idea or notion that some new, kind of new resurgence of creativity and some new cultural epoch was going to emerge out of Russia. And then what happened was the Bolshevik Revolution that kind of quelched that. And what's happening now, and this is the idea of the book, is that there's since the fall of the Soviet Union and then Russia going through this personality crisis it's been going through for since the fall of the Soviet Union. Who are we now? This is the idea they're trying to regain this notion that there was this wonderful promise at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century in Russia that got aborted by the Bolsheviks, but now we can go back to that and kickstart that. And that's sort of that was the thing. I mean, Putin's said that in a variety of different places and speeches, and he even he refers to different philosophers from this time that's called the Silver Age. So this is the whole notion. I mean, and in the 19th century, after the Napoleonic Wars, Russia defeated Napoleon. Just like now, recently we're having all the ceremonies and celebrations of VE Day. Well, Russia defeated Nazi Germany. So, I mean, when Russia defeated Napoleon, it was Holy Russia, the Holy Alliance. Russia defeated this tyrant, and so this is Russia had this messianic kind of character, or the sense of a mission that it had, and so Putin's trying to get that going again.
When you referenced there, obviously, like the big problem with any modern person trying to think about Russia is just still synonymous with the Soviet Union. And actually, if you're going to talk about anything mystical, magical, it feels like, well, it doesn't exist, right? Because the whole thing of the Soviet Union was it was so sterile. I mean, it was they were objectively saying, we're going to remove religion, all these concepts. Now, there's a very interesting concept that I could draw a parallel here with, which is that supposedly in anthropology, when they go into an area where they're, exploring like a tribe that lives in some place or some ancient tradition, if you ever find references that say, like what we find in history, what remains of their written or oral culture, if you ever find prohibitions against, say, a certain drug, the implication actually is they went really nuts on that before, and that's why they have to it's so harsh afterwards. It's like, right, this cannot happen again. No more of that. Let's get rid of that. That's verboten now. Is there something in this sense? Because that was the thing I was really amazed about when I read this book. I mean, I think of, again, the Soviet Union. I even think of the great writers like Dostoevsky. Sure, there's certainly a spiritual component, but there's almost the existential despair of where is God in all of this and stuff. So is there some kind of battle for the Russian soul in that sense?
Well, I mean, they're trying to regain this sense. Again, this Putin and the people that are happy with his notion of traditional values and that kind of thing. There's a whole myth about Moscow as the third Rome. There was Rome, then that fell to the barbarians, and then the second Rome, Constantinople, fell to the Turks in 1453. And then when that happened, Moscow, which had adopted, or Russia, which had adopted Greek Orthodox Christianity in the end of the 10th century, it fell to them to carry on the tradition, and they were the third Rome. And this is where Russia was Holy Russia. It was this messianic state, and actually around that time it was a theocracy in many ways. The weird thing about, think about it again. I'm no expert on Russian history, as some readers of the book may quickly point out. But what I do understand is that when it shouldn't have. Well, for Marxism, it shouldn't have happened in Russia. It was supposed to have happened in Germany, because it was the most highly industrialized nation. But they were so ready for something to happen there because of the plight of the serfs. Russia. The sad thing about Russia was parts of it were living in the Middle Ages or worse. This was the whole idea. There was this backward cousin of Europe, and it was always trying to catch up. To enormous efforts to catch up made by Peter the Great and Catherine the Great and so on and all that. And it kept sliding back into this kind of indolence and, Asiatic, somnolence and all this kind of things. The rhetoric would go. And when it finally, in our time, was given sort of the Western, values, the free market and democracy and all that. Sure. There was a kind of wonderful honeymoon the first couple of years, and then it all kind of collapsed. And this is I would say, they have. Again, I don't know about other nations, but I do get the impression that this whole idea of this personality identity crisis, this existential identity crisis, is something that's endemic to the Russian people, and they went through that throughout their sort of history. And the remarkable thing about the collapse of the Soviet Union, when I was a kid, I'm sure, I don't know, how old you are, but
it was only been 6, I think, so I don't remember it.
It was there, it was there. It was like this huge, thing that just was there, and it was on the other side of the planet. And it was like it was this monster that the West was going to finally have to, and then it was gone. And it all just kind of cracked and fractured and splintered. And it's remarkable that happened.
I had something I wanted to put to you, just in the vein of your book, which is I actually know some people who are from Russia and from the former USSR. And basically, when they experienced Western culture and they got to see how we force the USSR and Russia through our prism of our values and what we think of them and stuff. And obviously we have these naive notions like you're referencing of we're going to give them, democracy and this is going to help them. They actually were amazed that Westerners really believe that that's what Russia is and that's ever what Russia is, because they essentially tell me that there's this sense within Russia that it's like, oh, democracy and those are like Western values. Those are like America, Great Britain. Maybe it works over there. That's not really ours, though. So I was basically told they were never under any illusions that Boris Yeltsin and Putin were, just elected officials that are just like a Western politician is supposed to be, at least. It was always sort of understood. This is almost like having another czar, essentially. We've sort of gone back to that approach. So this is the person, and of course they're in power forever because they have the power. It was almost, there's a mixture of self-defeat and just as though almost not even wanting it, if that makes sense.
Well, I think there's a lot of cynicism too, because it was like, okay, yes, we're going to import, the free market and all that, and then take advantage of it. But the czar, Putin's just got himself back in power, and until when? I forget how long now.
It feels like he extends the date every few years, doesn't it?
No, it's like his final engagement one more time. It's like a band that's going on their farewell tour.
Yes. Make sure you get the tickets now. Exactly.
But, and it's, again, there is going back in the history, again, what I've learned from doing this book, there was a tradition of a more liberal, progressive, Western kind of political consciousness in Russia that was associated with Novgorod, which was kind of the rival city of Moscow back in the day. But the other forces are so dominant that they're able to just control that. I mean, we know that Putin's, critics either, they are silenced in one way or the other, often, rather radical ways, or they're just arrested. So, I mean, but there is, and so this is the more liberal, westernized Russians say, this whole idea that the Russians, they love a tyrant, they just love a czar. We love an authoritarian figure. This is the only way we can do it. This is a myth that's been, perpetuated by, rightly so, by the powers that want to stay in power and all that. But I don't know, because, what I gathered from doing this book, there's just quite a few examples of that just being the case, Not to say that there wasn't. There was this tradition in Novgorod and all that, but it kind of absorbed eventually into the main kind of body. All these stories like Ivan the Terrible, who's like, it's a good reason why he's called Ivan the Terrible. But then when he, basically said, okay, I'm out of here, and he left and he went on this kind of walk, and stayed away from Moscow, and the people went after him and begged him to come back. And he did, one condition, that he had even more absolute control after that. I mean, anybody who just bats an eye when I say anything, forget it. And okay, fine, we can't live without you. So, I mean, there's a great Goncharov's novel, Oblomov, which is about this Russian, what they call the superfluous man, he was kind of this cultural character who didn't have anything to do in the society. There's no place for him. And in the novel, I think the first chapter he's just getting out of bed or something like that. Or the rest of the book, he sits by the stove. And so there's this kind, again, it's stereotypical, and I apologize if, Russian readers feel that this is just horrible, stereotyping, but there is this kind of somnolent kind of heaviness. And then there's those eruptions, so, I mean, Russian history is like that. You have these kind of, very, still doldrum period, and then incredible, enormous eruptions and avalanches of things happening, and all of that. And it's in the Russian character themselves. They have this, it's either all or nothing. I mean, one of the Russian philosophers I referred to quite a bit in the book is a fellow named Nicholas Berdyaev, who nobody really reads these days, but he was actually enormously prolific. You talk about Colin Wilson. He was an enormously prolific writer. He was exiled out of Russia by Lenin in 1922, and he wound up in Paris eventually, and he just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. He continued writing into the late 40s and all that. But he says the Russians are people of extremes. It's all or nothing. It's the abyss or the millennium. So they don't have the Western ability to compromise and arrive at some kind of lukewarm medium place. It's one or the other, and they seem it's like the Russian history struck me as this kind of series of explosions, going on at different times. Sudden kind of bang things happen, and they seem to build up a kind of inner tension that wants that to happen.
I thought another interesting strain that you kind of brought out in this was that, one thing, even as just a layman in religious studies, is the second you encounter the Russian icons and the way the churches look, there's just incredible, expressionism, art. Like it's amazing, especially if you come from England and you've seen the Church of England. That seems pretty milquetoast in comparison. So one of the things I thought was an interesting thread you drew together was the idea that, in the same sense as part of the success of kind of the marketing campaign of Christianity was to go around the world and say, we'll just take all the stuff you had already and we'll figure out a way that it's Christian. Like, let's rename it. Let's make this holiday this one and this, they did very clever. Well, with Russians especially, a lot of people aren't going to know that they had their own sort of vibrant, is it paganism? What would you describe it as, that what existed before? But it's clearly channeled into the Christianity, right?
Yeah, well, pagan just means non-Christian.
Sure.
But, they had their own kind of indigenous Slavic belief in gods and nature gods and things of that sort. But what they were able to do was when they finally adopted Christianity. And I mean, that happened in the late 10th century. And it took a while for it to take completely, and it had to be kind of forcibly, imposed upon people. Vladimir I was the sort of ruler of Kiev at the time in the 990 something, I forget the exact date, but that when he converted, and he had to go from sort of town to town and basically dethrone the reigning pagan gods and knock down the statues and deface the kind of images and things of that sort, and then erect churches and that kind of thing. It took a while, but there's something that they call devovery, which is like double belief, in the sense that the people adopted Christianity, but they were able to maintain their earlier native folk pagan beliefs as well. And so there's, like Mary in the Christian iconography is very very popular in Russia, and scholars say, this is because of the earlier association with what they call damp Mother Earth. The earth, the soil, the Russian earth is very earthy people, very attached people. I mean, this is one of the things that supposed to differentiate between the Westerner and the Russian, is that according to Oswald Spengler, the Westerner, the European, looks up, and if you look at the Gothic spires, shooting up, into the sky, into the transcendental, but the Russians look out across the vast plains, of tundra and the steppe and all that. And they have this deep kind of relationship with the damp earth and all that kind of thing. And so Mary is, being the mother of God, basically, is associated with that. So they're able to accommodate, and other people have done that as well. The Russians were also one of the last ones to become Christianized. But when they did, they went for lock, stock, and barrel. And you talk about the icons, and in it when Princess Olga, it was Vladimir's grandmother, she had converted Christianity, and she went on a journey to Byzantium. She sailed to Byzantium. Yeats never did, but he wrote a poem about it, and which was Constantinople. And she was completely overwhelmed by the beauty. This is what sold her fundamentally on Greek Orthodox Christianity, and what sold Vladimir, because Vladimir sent out his scouts to. They went and they checked out Catholicism, and they checked out Islam, and and Greek Orthodox. And what sold Greek Orthodox for them was the beauty of the rites. So that was this. And you think about it at the time, again, we're overwhelmed with things, but back then, if you went to Constantinople, it was like nothing like it. Hagia Sophia, the huge cathedral, which up to wisdom, and which later was a mosque, and now it's a museum. It just stood out when you approached it. It just was this magnificent building on the horizon there, and it was just all this fantastic marble and incense and the chanting and all this kind of stuff, and she had a transformative experience, and she wanted to bring that back. And so, Dostoevsky says in The Idiot, beauty will save the world. And it comes out of that. And again, this is something it isn't quite the same in the Western Church. It isn't quite the same in Catholicism. You said something about the C of E. I know when I first came to England, I first went to a C of E church. I thought it had been burgled. I thought,
it's
where's
amazing,
all this
isn't it?
stuff?
It's so empty.
Where's all this? Nothing here. There's nothing here. And I know it's this existential kind of thing. It's just you and God, it's like nothing in between. It's like, well, I understand that from all those Bergman films. But it's like, where's the mediating, element, which is the beauty, which is the church. I was Catholic, I grew up Catholic, and I stopped going to church, I guess I was 13 or something. But, I remember, just all the images and all that kind of thing. And yeah, they could be over the top and pretty kitschy, but at least there was some way to relate. Then you go into these empty churches and there's nothing there. Well, that wasn't like that. If you thought, Catholic churches are kind of over the top, you go to the Greek Orthodox. It's
Sure.
more, and it's just transformative. It's a transformative experience. And the icons were supposed to be a way to do that. And the icons were more successful agent of converting the still pagan, people to the new way than any kind of argument or sermon, because they just were beautiful. And the whole idea was that, again, this is a difference too, because with the Russians, they want their art to save them. They don't want to be entertained by it. The Western, again, we don't have that, this is the high priests of art in the late 19th century, or people like Flaubert and all that kind of thing. But still, it isn't this salvific power that art had for in the Russian world, because it was an image, it was a glimpse of what the world was going to be like after Jesus came back. When the world was transfigured, the beauty of the icons were in anticipation of the transfigured world to come.
I thought an interesting way to end our interview, thanks very much for the time, was, since you've written about so many fascinating characters, and obviously there's areas of interest that you like to read in, there's the parallel to Wilson in that regard, I thought an interesting thing I could ask would be, if someone like you, they've read a Gary Lachman book and they're having a similar experience, they want to run down some of the threads of, who's this person he references, and you make allusions to obviously the literary works that you've enjoyed. Is there a someone who, to use a very vital writer, it could be someone where it's philosophical, because someone where it's fiction, and to you they just aren't read, or they aren't known enough, and to you this is someone incredible, you haven't maybe had a chance to write a book about them? Is there someone you'd recommend, like someone you could put someone on the trail to?
Well, it's quite a few. Someone I have written about is a fellow named Owen Barfield, who's not as well known as he should be, and he was a close friend of C.S. Lewis. He was a part of the Inklings, those guys that hung out in Oxford at the Babe and Bird.
Okay.
Who's there? Charles Williams, he's not known at all, but he was a Dante scholar and member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. He also wrote these occult thrillers back in the 30s that are still rather readable. So I've written about him quite a bit. But someone who another prolific writer whose style I just find so readable is Arthur Koestler.
Okay.
Nobody reads him anymore, which is unfortunate. And we know, his big book was Darkness at Noon, which is one of the great novels of the 20th century. And there's a whole story about him on the left bank, his relationship with Sartre and Camus and Simone de Beauvoir and all that kind of thing. It's fascinating kind of cultural history there. But, later Koestler, starts out a communist, realizes it's a dead end, writes a lot of anti-communist stuff and gets involved in a lot of anti-communist kind of activism. And then he has a change in the late 40s, and he starts writing this weird book about insight and outlook, which is about a theory of laughter. And that becomes this wonderful book called The Act of Creation. And then there's another one called The Ghost in the Machine. And he did this still, they're wonderfully readable books, and he's writing about ideas. And the thing with Koestler is that he was Hungarian, and he originally wrote in German, and then he also wrote in French, and then he came here, and then he wrote, and he has a wonderful story. His whole life story is incredible. He was imprisoned in the Spanish Civil War. He was imprisoned here in Pentonville when he came. He was imprisoned in France, once Germany declared war. And he knew Walter Benjamin and all these different people. But he wrote in the second part of his career, he wrote all this, to me, really, really interesting stuff about psychology and creativity and kind of anti-reductionist. He was very much, against all the reductionism going on in science and behaviorism and neo-Darwinianism and stuff like that. So there's a lot of bad press about him because this fellow named David Cesarini did this biography of him some years back, and all this stuff about him being kind of, almost a rapist and, being very violent towards women. But then there was another, Michael Scanlon, I think his name, did this other biography that said, no, Cesarini is just, he's kind of misinterpreting lots of stuff. So, but the thing about Koestler is, like, in his later career, he became very, very interested in parapsychology. I wrote a very interesting little book called Roots of Coincidence about that. And then he was very successful, and he left a large sum of money in endowment to University of Edinburgh to set up a chair in parapsychology. I don't know if it's still going there or not, but no, he just has this very, very readable style, and he had these really, really interesting ideas about consciousness and creativity and psychology and all that. So yeah, he's someone I think should be rediscovered.
Okay, I mean, I'm definitely. You got me with the line about that he was kind of writing against the reductionists, because I mean that is what, to me, that's, I won't say dead end. It's just an incredibly well explored corridor that everyone, I mean, it's practically everyone's worldview. How about this? Do you have any final words at the end of the interview, a message maybe, or some parting remarks?
Oh God, let's see, parting remarks. Well, stay alert. As the government's telling us, that's we have to say. This is the kind of thing. Right? I'm in no way trying to defend the Boris Johnson government, but I did see some people getting like really upset about like, well, you're not telling us exactly what to do, and sort of like, I mean, come on, I know there's a need for clear guidelines on a variety of areas, but at the same time, we've been kind of involved in this crisis now for a while, so
sure,
sort of like, well, do you really need to be told exactly what to do? At this point, I mean, I'm sure some people would say, yes, of course we do in this context. I understand that, but there's just a general kind of thing. So when I say stay alert, yes, that's the bottom line. Stay awake, stay alert, and make sure the thoughts in your head are yours and not someone else's.